Welcome. Just a quick intro, as this is my first recorded voiceover. This video has gone through 3 iterations to find the right tone, which I'll talk more about at the end. I wrote about 7,000 words on racism, which meant the video was about an hour. That didn't really work, so I'm covering a lot, but for brevity, I'm only summarizing and briefly mentioning the modern day. Plenty of people have covered this topic before if you want more. This is actually a 2-part video. The second part, which I haven't seen explored as much, is all about the sexual orientations and gender identities, so that'll be definitely interesting. Timestamps will be below for each race. So with that out of the way, first up is white people. Okay, no, I ain't touching this, not in this climate. Notes just say here that they are the devil.
Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it?
Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters.
So yeah. There is one thing I'd like to share on white people, and that's this critical issues poll, America's Attitude on Race and Ethnicity, conducted in 2022 among 2,091 respondents. On question 25, compared to 5 years ago, based on your own experience and interaction with others, how much racial, ethnic, or religious discrimination, if any, would you say exists in the following groups in the US today? And for the question of white Americans, 25% said a lot more. So I don't know, something to keep an eye on. So next up, we got Asian Americans. Alright, so summarizing in chronological order, we've got Chinese immigrants beginning to arrive in the US in large numbers during the mid-1800s, drawn by the California gold rush and jobs in the railroad construction. As the Chinese population grew, it gave rise to the Yellow Peril narrative, framing Asians as a threat to American jobs, culture, and racial purity. They were often portrayed as dirty, unassimilated, and unfit for citizenship, which then resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese labourers from immigrating to the US, which was the first law to ban immigration based on race. Then in 1907, we had the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, as well as the Immigration Act of 1924, which both restricted Japanese and other Asian immigrants. During World War II, there was 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly placed in internment camps, despite being US citizens by executive order from President Roosevelt at the time. After World War II, there was this rise to economic success amongst the Asian American community, and they became the model minority. So between World War II and now, there's been this shift, and as you can see, 61% of Asian Americans between ages 18 and 24 enroll in college, compared to the second down, which is white people at 41%. Then looking at income, you can see Asian Americans on average earn $90,500 a year, compared to white people at $76,700 a year. Now, if we look at the United States population, they account for 24 million people, or about 7.2% of the United States population, based on the US Census. So as you can see, Asian Americans have been quite successful in the US, which is probably why they've been a target for affirmative action. Looking at this article about a federal lawsuit in Massachusetts in 2014, when Asian Americans claimed that Harvard University's undergraduate admissions practices unlawfully discriminated against Asians. The lawsuit alleged that Harvard effectively employed quotas on the number of Asians admitted and holds them to a higher standard than whites. Since the 1990s, the share of Asians in Harvard's freshman class has remained stable at between 16 and 19%, while the percent of Asians in the US population more than doubled. Fast forward to 2023, and in a 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court, ruled that race-conscious admissions policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, UNC, violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, effectively ending affirmative action in college admissions. So finally, I just wanted to end on this. We need to talk about what it means to be white adjacent in tech. Asians in tech are now frequently considered so white adjacent that we are no longer identified as people of colour, as if the relative overrepresentation of some Southeast and South Asians with social, economic and education privilege means that the entirety of the AAPI community is no longer subject to issues of racism. So yeah, now I guess Asian Americans are considered white adjacent. I actually found an article about how Asian Americans in the medical community are often left out of conversations of diversity inclusion, but I'm not going to get into that. Alright, now that we're done talking about Asian Americans, now we're moving on to Native Hawaiians. So when James Cook arrived in 1778, he introduced diseases, and an estimated 300,000 natives lived on Hawaii at the time. The early 1800s was marked by Western missionaries and cultural erosion, promoting Western religion and values and discouraged native Hawaiian cultural practices. Then in 1848, land was privatised, shifting land control from communal ownership. 1887, we had the Bayonet Constitution, where the Hawaiian king was stripped of his power. 1893 was the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom and the end of the monarchy from a group of American and European businessmen with the support from the US military. By 1896, English had become the official language of the islands. 1898, that's when Hawaii was annexed by the US and became officially a territory. So following the US annexation, native Hawaiians were marginalised in their own homeland, losing much of their land to non-native settlers and facing economic disenfranchisement. Population had dwindled to just 30,000 by the year 1900. And during the 1900s, the US imposed English as the primary language in schools, and native Hawaiian cultural practices were discouraged. This resulted in the near extinction of the Hawaiian language and a decline in traditional customs. Continuing throughout the 20th century, the influx of non-native settlers and the development of industries such as tourism led to cultural erasure and land dispossession. In 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the US, despite opposition from many native Hawaiians. So in 1993, 100 years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, we had the US Apology Resolution, where the US government issued a formal apology for the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But it didn't result in any restitution or changes in government for native Hawaiians. So I don't know, the Hawaiians sounds like they got shafted pretty badly. Next up is the Native Americans. Beginning in the early 1600s saw early colonisation and displacing of Native American tribes from their lands through force, treaties and warfare, often viewed as savages, which introduced diseases such as smallpox, measles and influenza like with the Native Hawaiians. It was a period of forced conversion and cultural suppression, with missionaries who often sought to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Then in 1830, you had the Indian Removal Act, which forced the relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southern eastern US to territories west of the Mississippi River. It was followed by the Trail of Tears in 1838 to 1839, which was the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation. Moving forward to 1864, we had the Sand Creek Massacre, which was when US soldiers attacked and killed over 150 Native Americans. 1887 was the Dawes Act, which broke up tribal lands into individual allotments to pressure the assimilation of Native Americans into white society through selling their land to white people. 1890 was the Wounded Knee Massacre, which is when US troops killed an estimated 300 Native Americans. It was significant because it marked the end of major Native American resistance to the US government's policies. And during the late 1800s to the early 1900s, Native American children were actually taken from their families and placed in government or church-run boarding schools. And like with the Native Hawaiians, it was another example of cultural suppression of language and religion. 1924 was the Indian Citizenship Act, which the US granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the US, but many Indigenous people were still denied the right to vote. So that's just kind of a brief summary of Native American history, but there's something wholly unique to Native Americans, and that is that they were offered restitution. And that was things like land settlements and restoration, monetary compensation. But what was interesting is the self-governance and sovereignty granted to Native Americans. And one example was the Self-Determination Act of 1975, which the US recognised Native American tribes' right to self-governance, which allowed them to manage their own affairs, including education, law enforcement and healthcare. Another example was the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, IGRA, which was passed by Congress in 1988, established the legal framework for Native American tribes to operate casinos. It allows tribes to engage in gambling activities on tribal lands as long as they have a compact agreement with the state and the activities are permitted by state law. In 2023, tribal casinos nearly generated $42 billion in revenue. So again, that's wholly unique to Native Americans, and there's a lot of overlap between Native Americans and Native Hawaiians. But this is one of those areas where Native Americans saw some sort of restitution for what happened previously in the past. Okay, so next up is Latino Americans or Hispanics. I've just put Latino here. Beginning with the annexation of Mexican territories after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, many Mexicans were dispossessed of their land and faced second-class treatment. 55% of Mexican territory actually became part of the US, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. So at the end of the war, with California becoming part of the United States, there was the California Gold Rush, which lasted to 1848 to 1855, which saw Mexicans that were often excluded from mining claims when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. During the 1900s was again a period of segregation in schools, public places, and in urban barrios, which were neighbourhoods in poor areas. They were often subject to white-only policies, with Mexicans often being hired for low-paying jobs in agriculture, railroads, mining, and usually paid less than their white counterpart. Now, the Great Depression of 1929 was quite a turbulent period for all races, but especially for Mexicans. It has been estimated 2 million people of Mexican descent were forcibly repatriated over the Mexican border, often without due process or any proper documentation between 1930 and 1935. There was job discrimination as unemployment soared, limited access to relief programs, and cultural suppression. During this period, Mexican culture and traditions were often viewed with disdain and violence, as lynchings were not uncommon, as some white Americans blamed Mexicans for economic trouble. 1947 saw Mendez versus Westminster School District, which was a significant victory for civil rights. I could do a whole video alone just on this case. It's quite an interesting story. But just talking about it briefly, the case involved a group of Mexican-American families, including the Mendez family, who challenged the Westminster School District in Orange County, California. The school district had implemented a policy of segregating Mexican-American students into separate schools, claiming it was necessary to provide a suitable education. In February 1946, the court found that the segregated schools was indeed unequal and that the segregation of Mexican-American students was discriminatory and unconstitutional. It laid the groundwork for 1954, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that all school segregation based on race was unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. Operation Wetback of 1954 was a massive deportation program aimed at removing undocumented Mexican immigrants. More than 1 million people were deported, often again without due process. The term wetback is a slur for Mexican immigrants, referring to Mexican immigrants who enter the country by crossing the Rio Grande River. Proposition 187 in 1994 was a California ballot initiative passed by voters in November that aimed at restricting public services to undocumented immigrants. Jumping to the modern day, we have the forming of the Immigration Customs Enforcement, called ICE, which was created in 2003, and it was in response to the events of 9/11 and the need for a more coordinated approach to national security and immigration enforcement. So we see this overlap between Mexicans and Asians, both being immigrants and both coming over the Mexican border. However, where they originate from is obviously vastly different, with Asians coming from a different continent on the other side of the world. Alright, so black or African Americans, whichever you prefer. Alright, so as you can imagine, it's going to be quite a lengthy history with African Americans, but again, we're just summarizing. So starting in 1619, you had the first enslaved Africans who were brought to Virginia. 1793 was the rise of the cotton industry, and with the invention of cotton gin by Eli Whitney, it made cotton processing more efficient, which led to the expansion of slavery. The prosperity of the cotton industry created a narrative that justified the institution of slavery as an economically beneficial. Moving on to the 1830s to 1861 saw the rise of the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad, which was formed to help enslaved African Americans escape to free states in Canada where they could find safety and freedom. Coming to the end of slavery, we saw 1861 to 1865 the American Civil War, which was primarily fought over issues relating to slavery, states' rights, and economic differences between the North and the South. And on January 1st, 1863 is when we had the famous Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln, who declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. The proclamation did not free enslaved individuals in the border states, like Kentucky and Missouri, or in areas of the South under Union control. So the effect was limiting, but it did serve as a commitment to ending slavery by Lincoln. The post-Civil War had the Reconstruction era of 1865 to 1877, which sought to integrate formerly enslaved people into society. So from 1877 to the mid-1960s gave rise to the Jim Crow era, which mandated racial segregations in public facilities, including schools, transportation, restrooms, and restaurants. It was a period marked by disenfranchisement with numerous barriers to voting, including literacy tests, poll taxes, as well as racial violence, which was widespread against African Americans, including lynchings, beatings, and other forms of intimidation. Now, the separate but equal doctrine of 1896 was significant because it set the framework for social issues all the way up to the civil rights era of the 1960s. What it was a legal principle established by the US Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson. It upheld the constitutional racial segregation of laws for public facilities, stating that racial segregation was permissible as long as the separate facilities for the different races were equal, which they often were not. Moving forward to the 20th century, and in World War II, 500,000 African American men served in different units to their white counterparts. In July 1948 is when President Harry S. Truman finally integrated the US Armed Forces under an executive order mandating, quote, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, colour, religion or national origin." 1947 saw Jackie Robinson become the first African American player to play on a major league team. Now we move into the civil rights movement of the 1950s to 1960s. So race was really brought to the forefront in events like the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956, sparked by Rosa Parks. You had the Freedom Rides of 1961, and of course there was the March on Washington of 1963 at a large rally where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered that iconic speech, "I Have a Dream."
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
The 60s is really remembered for 3 landmark legislation acts that caused social reform. The first being the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin, and ended segregations in schools and public places.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the President, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
I must say that must have been a beautiful time to be alive and to actually witness that. But moving on. The second being the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which aimed to eliminate barriers preventing African Americans from exercising their right to vote. And the third being the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which aimed at eliminating discrimination in housing based on race, colour, national origin, religion, sex, and disability. The Fair Housing Act was actually signed just days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. after mounting public pressure. So then post-civil rights era, which was the late 1960s onwards, we saw the emergence of new movements like the rise of the Black Power movement, which morphed into the Black Lives Matter movement, which was founded in 2013 and continues today. We also saw the rise of the feminist movement and the gay rights movement. The final major event I'll mention is the Rodney King riots of 1992, when in 1991, Rodney King was pulled over for speeding and subsequently beaten up by LAPD officers, an event that was captured on video by a bystander. The footage showed the officers striking King repeatedly with batons while he lay on the ground, leading to public outrage. Cut to April 29, 1992, a jury acquitted the officers of all charges, so protests in LA led to riots, which resulted into widespread looting, arson, and violence, leading to significant destruction across the city. Over 60 people were killed, thousands were injured, and property damage was estimated at over $1 billion. So I definitely skipped some events, but I think that kind of summarizes racism in America briefly. And if I could distill it down to just one sentence, I'd say people throughout history really just saw someone who looks different and thought that's bad, whether that be in the US or across the world. Okay, so after all that, I'm just going to do a recap while talking about statistics and some differences. So if we look at the white population, they account for about 204 million people, or about 58.9% of the US population. So I have already mentioned this, but Asian Americans account for about 24 million people, or about 7.2% of the US population. They face segregation and exclusion like other races, are one of the two major immigrant groups like Latinos. However, post-World War II, the view on Asian Americans has changed. A notable difference though, because of their success on average, both financially and educationally, they've become a target for affirmative action, which only recently was ruled on, offering Asian Americans a path forward without barriers. The native Hawaiian population is only about 1.6 million people, and the fact that Hawaii is about 3,800 kilometers from the US mainland, they're often forgot about in conversations. People only remember Hawaii exists when Hawaii 5-0 is on, or people need a tropical place to holiday. Native Americans account for about 9.7 million people, representing about 2.9% of the US population. Again, they're the only race to receive some sort of restitution, like self-governance and sovereignty, as mentioned previously. So between Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, there's a lot of crossover. You have the introduction of diseases, you have land that's been annexed, you have cultural and language suppression, you have forced assimilation, you have removal from lands, you see a rise of a sovereignty movement, as well as segregation. Some differences are Native Americans being a much larger population and also located on the US mainland, unlike Native Hawaiians. And also with Native Hawaiians, it's more of land being privatized and forced to sell rather than Native Americans, where the land was just outright stolen and people forced off their land. And Native Americans also experience quite a number of massacres as well. So the Latino population in the United States, which is approximately about 62 million people, so they make up about 18.7% of the US population, so they're the second largest demographic. And so there is some overlap with Asian Americans, both facing segregation and exclusion from white people, both being two of the larger immigration groups, both facing immigration restrictions. However, post-World War II, the view on Asian Americans has changed, and depending on the government of the day will determine if Latinos can cross the border illegally or not. And like Native Americans and Hawaiians, the Latino population couldn't take part in economic prosperity. So then we come to African Americans, who represent about 47 million people in the United States, making up about 14.2%. So they also face a lot of discrimination through segregation. but they were the only people who were slaves in the United States. And looking at the US inmate population, they represent about 39% compared to white people at 56.8%, so they're very overrepresented. Thanks for watching. As I mentioned, this video went through a few different versions. Originally, the idea was the US oppression hierarchy, which is a social ladder, and how it intersects with the three modern determinant factors of identity politics and victimhood. Now, yes, I know people are going to take umbrage with that, but the two biggest issues I see is that the concept of actually tackling race with enough nuance is very difficult. And two, when I actually explored sexual orientation and gender identity, it became such an unruly behemoth because it's so vague and broad that it became impossible to actually map out. So part 2 will be just explaining all the genders, sexual orientations in great detail. So I just wanted to close by saying reality is often seen through an emotional lens and is based on a feeling, so it becomes an emotional truth.